I bought this house for $1 because everyone else believed it was worthless. I only wanted another renovation project and another paycheck. I had flipped enough abandoned properties to know that ugly houses usually hid the biggest profits, so when I saw the auction listing with a starting bid of $1, I thought someone had made a mistake. The previous owner had died almost 20 years earlier, no relatives had claimed the property, and the county had spent years paying taxes and maintaining land nobody wanted. Eventually, they decided they would rather give it away than keep losing money. I placed my bid mostly out of curiosity. 3 days later, the auction ended and I won. Nobody else had even tried. That should have been my first warning. The town was small enough that everyone noticed strangers. As soon as I stopped for gas, the cashier looked through the window at my truck and asked if I was going to the Harper house. I smiled and said yes, expecting him to tell me something about the roof or the plumbing. Instead, he became strangely quiet, then said, "I hope you don't plan on staying there after dark." Before I could ask why, another customer walked in, and he immediately changed the subject. I drove another 5 minutes until I reached the address. The house stood alone at the end of a dead road, surrounded by huge trees. The yard had disappeared beneath weeds almost as tall as my waist. The porch leaned to one side, and most of the windows were too dirty to see through. A county employee was already waiting outside. He handed me the keys and a folder full of documents. I asked if he wanted to walk through the house with me. He shook his head almost instantly and said, "I've already spent enough time in there." Then he got back into his truck and left before I even unlocked the front door. The smell inside was exactly what I expected: old wood, dust, mold, and damp air. What I didn't expect was how untouched everything looked. Plates still sat on the dining table. Books filled every shelf. Family photographs still hung on the walls. A jacket rested on the back of a chair, as if someone had planned to wear it again the next morning. It felt less like an abandoned house and more like time had simply stopped. I spent the next hour checking every room, making notes, and calculating repair costs. The kitchen would need to be replaced. The electrical system was outdated. The roof leaked in 2 places. Nothing unusual until I reached the hallway upstairs. Something immediately felt wrong. I couldn't explain why, but my eyes kept returning to the same wall. I opened the original blueprint from the county folder and started comparing measurements. Then I walked outside and measured the width of the house with my laser tool. 41 feet. I walked back inside and measured again. 36 feet. 5 feet had disappeared. I measured every room twice, thinking I had made a mistake. The numbers never changed. Somewhere inside that house, there was an entire section that officially didn't exist. I knocked on the hallway wall. The first part sounded solid. I moved a little farther and knocked again. This time, the sound echoed back hollow. I stood completely still, then knocked 3 more times. Same hollow sound. I looked closer. The paint was slightly newer than the surrounding wall. The baseboard was different too. Whoever had covered this area had done an incredible job because nobody would ever notice, unless they already suspected something was hidden. The next morning, I came back with tools and carefully removed the drywall. Behind it, I found old wooden planks. Then another layer. Then thick insulation. It looked as if someone had desperately wanted to erase whatever stood behind that wall. Nearly 2 hours later, my pry bar finally slipped through a narrow gap, and I pulled away the last board. Behind it was a wooden door without a handle, without a lock, and without any sign that it had ever been opened from the outside. Cold air drifted through the crack. It wasn't freezing, but it was much colder than the rest of the house. I pulled harder until the old door slowly swung inward. My flashlight revealed a staircase leading down, not up. Down made no sense because, according to every document, the house had no basement beneath this section. I should have called the county, or maybe even the police. Instead, curiosity won. I grabbed another flashlight, put on a respirator, and started walking down. Each step creaked beneath my boots, but something immediately bothered me. There were almost no spider webs. There should have been hundreds if this place had really been sealed for decades. At the bottom, I found a finished hallway. Wooden floors. Clean painted walls. A ceiling with old electrical lights. Someone hadn't built a storage room. They had built living space. The first room contained a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a bookshelf filled with children's books, and a small desk. Everything was covered by a thin layer of dust, but nothing looked damaged. It honestly felt like whoever lived there had simply walked away yesterday. Then my flashlight landed on a leather journal resting neatly in the middle of the desk. Beside it sat an old mechanical watch, frozen at exactly 8:17. I opened the journal, expecting to find a name. Instead, the first page contained only one sentence written in careful handwriting. If you are reading this, then I never made it out of this house. I turned to the second page and felt every hair on my arms stand up. The writer wasn't describing ghosts or monsters. He was describing people. He claimed someone had been secretly entering the house at night for months, without leaving a single sign of forced entry. He wrote that food disappeared. Objects changed places. Doors he had locked were somehow open again. At first, he blamed his own memory. Then he started marking tiny pencil lines on doors and drawers. Every morning, those marks had moved. Someone else had been inside the house while he slept. He tried staying awake all night, but every time he reached around 8:17, he would suddenly lose several hours without remembering anything. When he woke up, furniture had been moved, lights were turned off, and new muddy footprints appeared on the floor, even though every window and every door remained locked. He became so terrified that he built this hidden room, hoping whoever entered the house would never find him. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The final sentence on that page had clearly been added much later, in darker ink. It read, "I was wrong. They already know I'm here." The next page began with a date exactly 3 days after the previous entry. The handwriting had become shaky and uneven. He wrote that every night, the same thing happened. At exactly 8:17, he would hear footsteps somewhere above him. They never ran. They never stopped. They simply moved from room to room, as if someone were carefully checking every corner of the house. He finally worked up the courage to climb the stairs one night and look through a tiny crack he had left behind the hidden door. What he saw made no sense. There were two people walking through the hallway, carrying flashlights. They weren't police. They weren't thieves. They looked like ordinary men wearing work clothes. They searched every room, then quietly left without taking anything. The next morning, he asked his neighbors if anyone had visited the property. Nobody had seen a single vehicle. He reported everything to the sheriff, who searched the house from top to bottom and found nothing. The journal said that was the moment he realized nobody believed him anymore. I kept reading while sitting on the dusty floor. The next several pages described the same routine. Every few nights, the strangers returned. Always around the same time. Always searching. Never speaking. Then one sentence caught my attention. They never look for valuables. They only count doors. That line stayed in my head. I stood up and counted every doorway in the hidden hallway. Then I counted the doors upstairs. The numbers matched perfectly, except for one doorway shown on the old blueprint that no longer existed. Someone had removed an entire room from every official record. I searched the hidden room more carefully. Behind the bookshelf, I found a loose board. Inside was a small metal box containing old photographs, newspaper clippings, and a folded property survey. The survey was much older than the blueprint from the county, and it clearly showed another staircase leading beneath the hidden room. I looked around with my flashlight until I noticed metal rings fixed into the floor beneath an old rug. Together, they formed a square hatch buried under decades of dust. It took almost all my strength to pull it open. A wave of cold, stale air rose from below. My flashlight disappeared into another level, much deeper than the first. There was no way this basement had been built by accident. Someone had invested enormous effort creating it. I climbed down slowly. The walls changed from finished wood to rough concrete. At the end of a narrow corridor stood a heavy steel door hanging slightly open. Beyond it, I found shelves filled with cardboard archive boxes. Every box carried the same family name: Harper. I opened the nearest one, expecting personal documents. Instead, it contained property deeds, bank records, maps, and dozens of handwritten letters. The letters revealed something completely different from what I expected. The Harper family had spent years secretly documenting a land fraud scheme involving several influential people in the county. Farms had been purchased illegally. Elderly owners had been pressured into selling. Official records had been altered to hide everything. The man who wrote the journal believed someone had discovered what he knew. He wasn't hiding from imaginary visitors. He was hiding from people who wanted every piece of evidence destroyed. I suddenly remembered the cashier at the gas station and the county employee. Neither of them had warned me about ghosts. They had warned me about the house. Before I could read another page, I heard it. A floorboard creaked somewhere above me. Then another. Slow, steady footsteps moved across the hidden hallway. I turned off my flashlight and listened. Someone had entered the house. The footsteps stopped directly above the staircase leading down to me. Then a beam of light appeared at the top of the stairs. I held my breath. A man's voice broke the silence. "He's been down here," the second voice answered. Then we're too late. My heart started pounding. They weren't guessing. They knew someone had found the hidden rooms. I quietly backed deeper into the archive room until my foot struck something metal. It was an old rotary telephone. I almost laughed because there was no chance it still worked. Then I noticed the wire running through the wall. I lifted the receiver. There was a dial tone. I immediately called emergency services, whispered the address, and told the operator there were unknown people inside the house destroying evidence. She kept asking questions, but I heard footsteps getting closer. So I placed the receiver on the floor without hanging up. Minutes felt like hours. The voices moved through the basement, opening boxes and throwing papers aside. One of them said, "Find the survey. Without it, none of this matters." I realized they hadn't found the box hidden behind the bookshelf because it was still inside my backpack. I slipped through a narrow maintenance tunnel at the back of the archive room, barely wide enough to crawl through. The tunnel eventually led to an old storm drain behind the house. I pushed open a rusted grate and crawled into the fresh air, just as police sirens echoed down the road. The two men tried to leave through the front door, but officers were already surrounding the property. Because my emergency call had remained connected, dispatch had recorded part of their conversation. Investigators spent the next several months examining every document recovered from the hidden basement. The evidence reopened corruption cases that had been forgotten for decades. Several officials were charged with crimes stretching back more than 20 years. The hidden room wasn't built to hide treasure. It was built to protect the truth. The journal's author never escaped because he died from illness while hiding underground, long before anyone discovered him. His final hope was that someday, someone would find the evidence and finish what he had started. The county later offered to buy the house back from me for far more than I had invested. I refused. I restored it instead. The hidden rooms remain exactly as they were found because they are now part of the investigation archive. Sometimes visitors ask me whether the story is really true. I simply smile, point toward the hallway upstairs, and tell them, "Count the walls. Before you count the rooms."